The Pacific stretched before Crescent Bay, like a sheet of hammered silver, unnaturally calm for a September morning. Captain Thomas Kane stood at the wheel of his weathered trawler Redemption, squinting through salt-stained glass at the horizon. After 37 years working these waters, he'd learned to read the ocean's moods like a barometer. The subtle shift in wave patterns that preceded storms, the particular quality of light that warned of changing winds, the way seabirds altered their flight paths when deep currents shifted below. Today felt different, charged with an electricity that made the hair on his weathered forearms stand on end. The morning had started like countless others. Thomas had risen at 4:30, made his ritual cup of black coffee, and walked the short distance from his weathered cottage to the harbour. The docks were already alive with the familiar symphony of preparation. Diesel engines coughing to life, the metallic clatter of equipment being loaded, the low voices of fishermen checking weather reports and sharing gossip. But before we dive deeper, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Engines running rough again, called Miguel Santos from the stern, his voice carrying over the gentle lap of waves against the hull. The young fisherman's dark eyes reflected concern as he checked the nets one more time, his calloused hands moving with practiced efficiency despite his relative youth on these waters. At 24, Miguel was the newest addition to Thomas's small crew, but his instincts for the sea ran deep, a gift inherited from his grandfather, who had fished these same waters until arthritis finally forced him to shore. Thomas nodded, his calloused hands gripping the worn steering wheel that had guided him through everything from glass-calm days to winter storms that tried to tear his boat apart. The diesel engine had been giving them trouble for weeks, a persistent knocking that the mechanic in Port Harbour couldn't quite diagnose, a hesitation when they needed power most. But this morning, it seemed to purr with unusual smoothness, as if some invisible hand had reached into its mechanical heart and set everything right. "She sounds fine to me," he muttered, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from beneath the glassy surface. Thomas had survived 4 decades on these waters by trusting his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was now screaming that this was no ordinary morning. Behind them, the town of Crescent Bay was beginning its daily awakening. Smoke rose from chimneys as coffee percolated and breakfast skillets heated. Children prepared for school, their voices carrying on the still air as they walked the tree-lined streets that curved with the natural contours of the bay. The lighthouse at the point had finished its nightly vigil, its beam no longer needed now that dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. On shore, Dr. Elena Vasquez was making her morning rounds at Crescent Bay's small clinic when she paused at the window facing the harbour. The oceanographer turned physician had moved to this remote Oregon coastal town 5 years ago, seeking solitude after a devastating research accident had claimed her colleague's life during a deep-sea expedition. The memories still haunted her dreams, the screaming alarms, the imploding habitat, the moment when she realized she couldn't save the brilliant marine biologist who had become both her mentor and closest friend. Now, watching the eerily still waters through the clinic's salt-stained window, her scientific mind began cataloging anomalies with the methodical precision that had once made her one of the most promising researchers in her field. The ocean's behavior this morning defied several fundamental patterns she'd studied for over a decade. The gulls weren't following their usual patterns. Instead of scattered foraging along the tide line or their typical harassment of fishing boats, they circled in tight formations far beyond the breakers, their cries sharp with an agitation she'd never observed. The tide pools she'd studied obsessively during her first lonely years in Crescent Bay seemed unusually active, as if responding to some invisible signal that human senses couldn't detect. Even the kelp beds visible through the clear water appeared to sway in patterns that had nothing to do with current or tide. "Dr. Vasquez?" Maria Delgado, the clinic's receptionist, appeared in the doorway with a steaming mug of coffee and the concerned expression she wore whenever Elena lost herself in observation. Maria had been trying for 3 years to draw the reserved doctor into the town's social fabric, organizing coffee dates that Elena politely declined and inviting her to community events that usually found Elena working late at the clinic instead. Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, but remained at the window. Something in the water caught her eye. A dark shadow moving beneath the surface with purpose and intelligence, too large and deliberate to be debris. Then another, and another. Her pulse quickened as her trained eye recognized the distinctive movement patterns of large marine mammals, but in formations she'd never documented in any of her research. At the Lighthouse Point Cafe, Isabella Torres was preparing the morning's first batch of her famous cinnamon rolls, their sweet aroma already beginning to fill the cozy space that served as the town's unofficial community center. Isabella had inherited both the cafe and her grandmother's gift for reading the subtle signs that preceded extraordinary events. This morning, every instinct inherited from generations of coastal women was telling her to pay attention. The radio mounted behind the counter crackled to life with the Coast Guard's routine weather report. But it was interrupted by an unusual transmission that made Isabella pause in her work. Flour-dusted hands frozen above the mixing bowl. This is Captain Rodriguez on the Maria Elena, about 2 miles northwest of Crescent Bay. We're seeing unusual whale activity. Large pod, maybe 20 humpbacks, moving in tight formation. They're not feeding. Repeat, they're not exhibiting feeding behavior. They appear to be escorting something. Isabella wiped flour from her hands with the deliberate care of someone trying to steady her nerves and stepped onto the cafe's small deck that overlooked the harbour. Born and raised in Crescent Bay, she'd witnessed countless whale migrations during her 38 years, but never anything like what Captain Rodriguez was describing. Her grandmother's stories came flooding back, tales passed down through generations of coastal families about the sea delivering gifts to those who needed them most, about whales serving as guardians for treasures beyond human understanding. The transmission continued, Captain Rodriguez's voice tense with wonder and disbelief. There's something in the center of the formation. Something white. It's standing upright in the water. I've never seen anything like this. The whales seem to be protecting it. Isabella's coffee cup slipped from her hands, shattering on the deckboards. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the morning stillness, but she barely noticed. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, speaking of ancient promises and gifts from the depths, of guardians who remembered their duties long after humans had forgotten theirs. Thomas cut his engine and let the redemption drift as the whale pod approached, the sudden silence profound after hours of diesel rumble. Through his binoculars, he could see the magnificent creatures moving with military precision, their massive bodies creating barely a ripple as they glided through the water with a grace that defied their enormous size. Each whale maintained perfect position relative to its neighbors, their movements synchronized with an intelligence that made Thomas's skin prickle with recognition of something far beyond animal instinct. But it was the object at the center of their formation that made his breath catch in his throat and forced him to lower the binoculars to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible over the gentle lap of waves against the hull. The young fisherman crossed himself with automatic reverence as he stared at the pale figure riding the swells with impossible stability. "Captain, what is that? How is it staying upright?" The statue, for that's what it undeniably was, stood perfectly vertical despite the gentle rolling of the ocean. Carved from what appeared to be pure white marble that gleamed like pearl in the morning sunlight, it depicted a woman in flowing robes that seemed to move with their own breeze. Her arms were extended in a gesture that spoke of blessing and protection. Her serene face tilted slightly downward, as if watching over all who approached with infinite compassion. The whales surrounding her moved like an honor guard that had practiced this formation for generations. 2 massive bulls flanked the statue directly, their movements synchronized to create a protective corridor of calm water. Their scarred hides spoke of decades in these waters, of battles with giant squid in the lightless depths and narrow escapes from the ships that had once hunted their kind. Behind them, a semicircle of adults and juveniles maintained perfect spacing, their tails moving in unison to propel the mysterious cargo forward at a pace that seemed almost ceremonial in its deliberation. The largest whale, a matriarch whose barnacle-encrusted head rose like an ancient island when she surfaced, released a low call that vibrated through the water and seemed to resonate in Thomas's chest. It wasn't the feeding call he knew, nor the song that marked their migrations. This was something else entirely, a sound that carried authority and purpose, as if she were announcing the arrival of something precious beyond measure. On shore, Word spread through the town with the speed that only small communities can achieve. Elena had abandoned her clinic duties and now stood on the rocky promontory overlooking the bay, her trained eye taking in every detail with the systematic observation that had once made her reputation in marine research. The statue showed no signs of damage despite what must have been a long ocean journey. More impossibly, it remained perfectly stable even as the whale's movements created subtle currents around it that should have toppled any object not secured to the seafloor. The physics were all wrong. Marble had specific density characteristics that made it sink rapidly in salt water. Even if some miracle of buoyancy kept it afloat, the center of gravity was all wrong for the stability she was witnessing. The statue should be rolling with each swell, tumbling in the turbulence created by 20 massive bodies moving through the water. Instead, it rode the waves as steadily as if it were planted on solid ground. "The physics don't make sense," she murmured to Father Gabriel Morales, who had climbed the rocky path to stand beside her despite the arthritis that usually kept him close to his small church. The elderly priest's weathered hands gripped his walking stick as he watched the procession with tears streaming down his cheeks, his lips moving in silent prayer. Father Gabriel had served this community for 42 years, had baptized most of the adults now gathering on the shore, had buried their parents and grandparents in the small cemetery behind his church. He'd seen faith tested by tragedy and strengthened by joy, had wrestled with his own doubts during the dark nights of the soul that visited every priest. But he'd never seen anything that challenged his understanding of the possible like the sight approaching their shore. "Perhaps," Father Gabriel said softly, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent pondering the mystery of divine intervention, "physics isn't what we're witnessing here." The town's harbour master, David Kim, had launched his patrol boat and was now maintaining a respectful distance from the formation. A former Navy man who'd seen action in 3 conflicts before settling in this quiet coastal town, David understood the ocean's power and unpredictability better than most. His radio chatted with reports from other vessels, all confirming the same impossible sight. Commercial fishing boats, pleasure craft, even a Coast Guard cutter had diverted course to witness the procession. But all maintained distance, as if recognizing that this was something that demanded respect rather than investigation. The whales showed no aggression toward the human observers, no fear that might cause them to alter their course or abandon their mysterious cargo. Their behavior suggested not just intelligence, but purpose. The kind of single-minded dedication that Thomas had seen in sheepdogs protecting their flock or mothers defending their young. But this protective instinct was directed towards something that wasn't even alive, at least not in any biological sense. Isabella had closed the cafe and stood among the growing crowd on the harbour's main pier, her hands twisted in her apron as she watched the procession's approach. Children pressed against the railings while their parents held them steady, everyone straining for a better view of something that would become the defining moment of their lives. The morning mist had lifted completely now, revealing the procession in startling clarity against the deep blue of the Pacific that stretched to the horizon. Around her, Isabella could hear fragments of prayer in different languages, exclamations of wonder, and the kind of hushed speculation that accompanies moments when the impossible intrudes upon the everyday. Mrs. Chen from the hardware store was explaining to her grandson that whales were very smart, but even she seemed uncertain how to account for what they were witnessing. The teenagers who usually spent their mornings absorbed in their phones had forgotten their devices entirely, drawn into something that no screen could contain. "She's coming home," Isabella whispered, remembering her grandmother's stories told during winter evenings when the wind howled around their cottage and the sea seemed full of voices. "Abuela always said the sea keeps its promises, even when we forget what we asked for." The whales slowed as they approached the shallower waters near shore, their massive forms becoming more distinct as they rose and fell in the gentle swells. Their formation tightened, creating an even more protective circle around the statue, and Thomas could see individual scars and markings that told stories of long lives in the ocean's depths. The largest whale, the matriarch who seemed to lead the group, bore a distinctive pattern of barnacles across her head and a long scar along her flank that might have come from a ship's propeller decades ago. She surfaced near the statue's base and released another low, resonant call that seemed to vibrate through the water and into the bones of everyone watching from shore. The sound carried across the bay with a quality that made even the children fall silent, as if recognizing they were hearing something ancient and sacred. Other whales answered with their own calls, creating a harmony that had never been recorded by marine biologists, a song that seemed to announce the completion of a journey that had begun far from human sight. Thomas had maneuvered the Redemption closer, his engine idling so softly it was barely audible. Through the clear water, he could see the statue's base was encrusted with marine growth that told stories of deep ocean travel, the kind of barnacles and algae that grew only in specific oceanic conditions, evidence of a journey through waters that few humans had ever seen. Yet somehow, impossibly, it remained upright, as stable as if it were anchored to the seafloor itself with invisible chains. The currents should have toppled it 100 times over, Elena said to no one in particular, her scientific mind struggling with what she was witnessing. She had pulled on her wetsuit and was now standing waist-deep in the surf, her underwater camera ready to document whatever was about to happen. The water was unusually warm for September, and she could feel strange currents moving around her legs. Not the random turbulence of waves meeting shore, but organized flows that seemed to spiral around some invisible center. The whales began their final maneuver with the precision of a military operation. Working in perfect coordination, the two bulls positioned themselves on either side of the statue, while the others created a living breakwater, their bodies absorbing the force of incoming swells with practiced ease. Slowly, deliberately, they began to lift their precious cargo, their movements generating the kind of gentle pressure that could raise a sunken ship or guide a lost vessel to safety. The surface of the water around the statue began to glow with phosphorescence stirred by the whale's movements, creating an ethereal light that made the marble seem to shine from within. Elena had seen this phenomenon before during night dives, but never in daylight, never with this intensity. The microscopic organisms that created the light were responding to something beyond simple mechanical disturbance. Miguel waded into the water alongside Thomas and David Kim, their hands extended to help guide the statue to safety. The moment Miguel's fingers touched the marble, he gasped and nearly stumbled backward. The stone wasn't cold as he'd expected, but warm. Not with the artificial heat of sunlight, but with something deeper, a pulse that seemed to flow from within the carved figure itself. "I can feel her heartbeat," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and something approaching fear. The warmth traveled up his arms and seemed to settle in his chest, a rhythm that synchronized with his own pulse until he couldn't tell where his heartbeat ended and the statue's began. Thomas nodded grimly as he placed his own hands on the marble surface. He'd felt it too, a gentle rhythm that seemed to emanate from the stone itself, as if the carved figure contained some spark of actual life. Together with David, whose military training had taught him to adapt quickly to impossible situations, the three men helped ease the statue onto the sandy bottom as the whales maintained their protective formation around them. The statue was heavier than expected, its marble form requiring 6 men to lift it clear of the waves. As they carried it toward the shore, a profound silence fell over the crowd that had gathered. Even the children stopped chattering, sensing they were witnessing something sacred, something that would be remembered and retold for generations. Father Gabriel waded into the surf despite his age and the arthritis that made each step painful, his black vestments darkening as the salt water soaked through the fabric. When he reached the statue, he placed both hands on its base and began to pray in Latin, his voice carrying across the water with surprising strength. The ancient words seemed to hang in the air, mixing with the sound of waves and whale song to create a moment of pure transcendence. Behind them, the whales began to withdraw, with the same deliberate precision they'd shown throughout their approach. One by one, they turned and swam back toward deeper water, but not before each seemed to acknowledge the crowd gathered on shore. The matriarch was the last to leave, surfacing one final time near the beach where the statue now rested safely above the tide line. Her ancient eye, dark and intelligent beyond anything in Thomas's long experience on the ocean, seemed to look directly at the gathered crowd. In that gaze was something that might have been satisfaction, or blessing, or simply the acknowledgement of a task completed. Then she too disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only a gentle disturbance on the surface to mark where she'd been. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Even the gulls that had been circling seemed to pause in their flight, as if recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in their world. On the beach, the statue stood exactly as it had in the water, serene, upright, and somehow alive despite being carved from stone. By evening, the statue had been moved to the community centre, a process that required careful planning and the combined strength of a dozen volunteers. It now stood in the main hall surrounded by candles that seemed to have appeared from nowhere, their flames flickering in the ocean breeze that came through open windows. Fresh flowers had been placed at its base. Roses from Mrs. Patterson's garden, wildflowers gathered by children from the coastal meadows, even exotic blooms from the florist shop that had closed its doors early so the owner could contribute to the growing shrine. Dr. Patricia Blackwood, an art historian from Portland University, had arrived within hours of the first news reports spreading across social media and local news stations. She now stood before the sculpture with a magnifying glass, her practiced eye taking in details that spoke of master craftsmanship and centuries of artistic tradition. The crowd that had gathered watched her examination with the focused attention usually reserved for medical diagnoses or court verdicts. "Carrara marble," she announced to the assembled townspeople, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades studying religious art from around the world. 15th century Italian craftsmanship, possibly from the workshop of Antonio Rossellino or one of his contemporaries. The style is consistent with religious sculptures commissioned for New World churches during the colonial period, when wealthy European families funded missions throughout the Americas. She traced the air above the statue's robes with her finger, not quite touching the marble, but following the lines carved by some master sculptor centuries ago. See how the fabric falls? The way the light catches in these folds? This wasn't mass-produced. This was created by someone who understood both the technical requirements of marble carving and the spiritual significance of what they were creating. Elena leaned forward from her seat in the front row, her scientific training demanding answers, even as her heart wanted simply to accept the mystery. How long could something like this survive in the ocean? Dr. Blackwood's expression grew troubled as she considered the question. Under normal circumstances? A few months at most before the salt water would begin serious erosion. Marble is particularly susceptible to chemical weathering from seawater. The calcium carbonate that gives it structure breaks down rapidly in saltwater conditions. This piece shows minimal damage despite what appears to be extensive marine growth on the base. It's unprecedented. She knelt to examine the base more closely, her flashlight revealing the intricate patterns left by decades of marine organisms. These barnacles, this algae growth, it would take years to develop in deep ocean conditions. But the marble itself shows no significant pitting, no erosion patterns that should be inevitable after prolonged saltwater exposure. I've never seen anything like it. Thomas stood near the back of the room, still in his salt-stained work clothes, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "What about the whales?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades spent reading the ocean's moods. "In 40 years of fishing, I've never seen them behave like that. They moved like they had orders, like they knew exactly what they were doing." Dr. Blackwood shook her head, her expertise extending to art and artifact, not marine biology. "I study art, not whale behavior, but I can tell you this statue was made to be treasured, not lost at sea. Someone commissioned this with great love and considerable expense. The quality of the carving, the choice of marble, the attention to detail. This represents months of work by a master craftsman." Isabella raised her hand from where she sat near the middle of the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose roots in this community went back generations. "My grandmother used to tell stories about a ship that went down in a storm maybe 60 years ago. It was carrying artwork from Mexico to a new church in Alaska. She said the cargo was blessed before it sailed, that the priests who loaded it prayed for safe passage and divine protection." The room buzzed with murmurs as people began to piece together fragments of family stories and half-remembered local legends. Old-timers nodded, recalling tales their own grandparents had told about ships lost in winter storms and cargo that sometimes washed ashore years later. But no one had ever heard of anything arriving in the manner they'd witnessed. Father Gabriel, who had remained quiet until now, stood slowly with the careful movements of someone whose body carried the weight of decades. "There are records," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the hushed room. "In the diocesan archives in Portland, a vessel called the Santa Teresa was lost in 1963 during a winter storm. It was carrying religious artifacts donated by wealthy families in Guadalajara to missions along the Pacific coast. The silence that followed was complete. Even the children seemed to understand they were hearing something important, a piece of the puzzle that had been missing for over half a century." David Kim stepped forward, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "I can contact the Coast Guard, check their historical records for wrecks in the area. If there's documentation of the cargo manifest, we might be able to confirm whether a statue matching this description was on board." But Elena found herself less interested in the statue's origins than in the mystery of its arrival. The oceanographer in her was fascinated by questions that had no easy answers. "Even if it somehow broke free from a wreck," she said, her voice carrying the measured tone of scientific analysis, "the currents in this region flow north to south during this season. For it to reach us from any recorded wreck site in the area, it would have to travel against the prevailing flow for hundreds of miles. Unless," Miguel said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised everyone, including himself, "something was guiding it." The young fisherman's words hung in the air like a challenge to everything rational, everything explainable. But as the crowd looked around the room at the statue standing serenely in their midst, surrounded by candlelight and flowers, and the faces of people whose lives had been touched by something extraordinary, rationality seemed less important than the simple fact of what they had witnessed. Outside, the ocean continued its eternal rhythm, waves rolling onto the shore that had received this impossible gift. And somewhere in the depths beyond their sight, the guardians who had completed their mission continued their ancient patrol of waters that held mysteries no human science could fully comprehend. In the days that followed, Crescent Bay began to transform in ways both subtle and profound. The changes started small, fishermen returning with nets fuller than they'd been in years, mechanical problems that had plagued the community for months resolving themselves mysteriously, small acts of kindness multiplying throughout the town like ripples spreading across still water. Thomas's engine trouble disappeared entirely overnight. The Redemption now ran smoother than it had in years, its diesel purring with the contentment of machinery that had remembered its purpose. His catches were the best of his career, not just in quantity, but in quality, with fish that seemed to swim directly into his nets as if eager to provide for the community that had welcomed their oceanic visitor. When he mentioned this to other captains at the harbour's morning coffee gathering, they nodded knowingly, each sharing similar stories of mechanical problems solving themselves and fishing grounds that had suddenly become more generous. Captain Rodriguez, whose radio call had first alerted the town to the approaching procession, reported that his chronically unreliable navigation system now worked perfectly. "It's like the sea wants us to find what we're looking for," he told the assembled group. At the clinic, Elena noticed her patients recovering faster than medical science could explain. Mrs. Patterson's chronic arthritis, which had kept her housebound for months, showed dramatic improvement after she spent an hour sitting quietly with the statue. The inflammation markers in her blood work dropped to levels Elena hadn't seen in the elderly woman's file in over 5 years. Young Bobby Chen's asthma attacks, which had been getting progressively worse despite the best treatment Elena could provide, suddenly ceased altogether. His mother brought him in for what they expected would be another adjustment to his medication, only to discover that his lung function had improved so dramatically that he no longer needed his inhaler. "There has to be a scientific explanation," Elena told Isabella over coffee at the Lighthouse Cafe, her medical training demanding rational answers even as the evidence defied conventional understanding. "Placebo effect, improved community morale affecting stress levels, confirmation bias influencing how we interpret normal variations in health outcomes." Isabella smiled and refilled Elena's cup with the special blend she reserved for friends, her movements carrying the easy grace of someone who had found peace with mystery. "Does it matter what we call it? Look around. When was the last time you saw people this happy, this connected to each other? Elena had to admit the town felt fundamentally different. Neighbours who hadn't spoken in years following some forgotten slight were now working together on community projects with the enthusiasm of old friends. The teenagers had organised themselves into volunteer groups, helping elderly residents with shopping and yard work without being asked. Even the weather seemed more cooperative, with gentle rains that nourished the coastal gardens without causing the erosion that usually plagued the cliffs. The changes extended beyond the purely practical. At the elementary school, teachers reported that disciplinary problems had virtually disappeared. Children who had been struggling academically were suddenly engaged and eager to learn. The art teacher, Miss Rodriguez, found her students creating works of surprising beauty and sophistication, as if their young minds had been opened to possibilities they'd never considered before. Father Gabriel had moved the statue to his small church after the community centre proved inadequate for the crowds that wanted to see it. St. Mary's of the Bay, which had struggled with dwindling attendance for years as young people moved away and older parishioners passed on, was now full every Sunday. But more than that, it had become a place where people from different faiths and backgrounds came together, drawn by something that transcended denominational boundaries. People came from neighbouring towns to see the statue, bringing offerings of flowers, handwritten prayers, and small tokens of gratitude. Catholics knelt before it in familiar reverence, but so did Protestants, Jews, Buddhists, and those who claimed no particular faith at all. The statue seemed to speak to something universal in the human spirit, a longing for connection with something greater than the struggles of daily life. Miguel found himself appointed as the statue's unofficial guardian, though he'd never sought the role. People sought him out, asking to hear his account of that miraculous morning on the water. He would tell them about the warmth of the marble, the intelligence in the whale's movements, the profound silence that fell over everything as the procession approached shore. They weren't just carrying her, he would say, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had found his calling as a storyteller. They were delivering a gift, but not just to us. Through us, to everyone who needs to remember that the world is still capable of wonder. His words spread through the community and beyond, carried by visitors who returned to their own towns with stories that strained credibility, but carried an emotional truth that couldn't be denied. Social media posts about the whale escort went viral, bringing reporters and documentary filmmakers who came expecting to debunk a local legend and left as believers in something they couldn't quite name. Word of the statue's miraculous arrival spread far beyond Crescent Bay, carried by news reports that struggled to capture the profound impact of what had occurred. Within a month, pilgrims began arriving from across the country and eventually from around the world. The town's small motel filled to capacity almost overnight, forcing residents to open their homes to visitors in a display of hospitality that surprised even long-time locals. What could have been an overwhelming invasion instead became something like an extended family reunion. Visitors arrived expecting to encounter the commercialized exploitation that usually accompanied such phenomena, but instead found a community that had been genuinely transformed by their experience. There were no souvenir shops selling mass-produced trinkets, no admission fees to see the statue, no tours guided by entrepreneurs looking to profit from the miraculous. Dr. James Wright, a marine biologist from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, arrived to study the whale behavior that had made the statue's arrival possible. After interviewing witnesses and reviewing Elena's underwater footage, he could offer no conventional explanation for what had occurred. Humpbacks are intelligent, social creatures, he told a gathering at the community centre, his PowerPoint presentation showing decades of research into cetacean behaviour. They've been observed protecting other species from predators, even assisting in rescues. There are documented cases of whales helping drowning humans reach shore, of mothers from one pod caring for orphaned calves from another. But coordinated behaviour of this complexity, involving so many individuals over what must have been hundreds of miles, it challenges everything we know about cetacean cognitive abilities and social organisation. He showed video footage of the escort that had been captured by multiple witnesses, analysing the formation patterns and synchronised movements with the precision of a military historian studying battle formations. This level of cooperation requires not just intelligence, but communication systems we don't fully understand. They maintained perfect positions relative to each other and to the statue across changing currents and wave conditions. It's unprecedented in the scientific literature. Elena had been documenting the changes in the town with the thoroughness that had once made her reputation as a researcher. Her medical records showed a dramatic decrease in depression, anxiety, and stress-related illnesses across all age groups. The local police reported that crime had virtually disappeared. Not just serious offences, but even minor infractions like traffic violations had ceased. It's as if the entire community is functioning at a higher level, she told Doctor Wright during one of their long conversations on the bluff overlooking the harbour. People are more patient, more generous, more willing to help each other solve problems. The social dynamics have shifted in ways that sociology textbooks say should take generations to achieve. Mass hysteria can work in positive directions, he suggested, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation. Religious euphoria, collective optimism triggered by a shared, extraordinary experience. Elena shook her head, her scientific training rebelling against such simplistic explanations. This isn't hysteria. It's sustained behavioral change across all demographics and personality types. Something fundamental has shifted in how people relate to each other and to their environment. The statue itself continued to defy analysis by experts who arrived with increasingly sophisticated equipment. Marine biologists confirmed that the barnacles and algae on its base were consistent with deep ocean growth patterns spanning decades. Carbon dating of the organic material suggested the statue had been in salt water for approximately 60 years, matching the timeline of the Santa Teresa's disappearance. Yet the marble showed no significant salt damage, no pitting or erosion that should have been inevitable after such prolonged exposure. Metallurgist Dr. Sarah Kim from Oregon State University examined samples of the marine growth and found mineral compositions that suggested the statue had traveled through oceanic regions that few research vessels had ever explored. The isotope ratios in these barnacles tell a story of deep Pacific currents, she explained to a gathering of scientists and townspeople. This statue has been places where light never penetrates, where the pressure would crush a human body instantly. Yet somehow it maintained its structural integrity and remained upright through forces that should have reduced it to fragments. Thomas had taken to visiting the church each morning before heading out to sea, a ritual that had evolved naturally from his need to process what he had witnessed. He would stand before the statue in the early morning light, streaming through stained glass windows, feeling that same strange warmth he'd experienced when they first pulled it from the water. "I don't know if you can hear me," he would whisper, his voice barely audible in the sacred silence. "But thank you. For whatever you've brought to this place, for whatever you've awakened in all of us, thank you." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had to offer in return for a gift that had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. The statue never responded, never moved, never showed any sign of consciousness beyond the serene expression carved into its marble features. Yet Thomas always left feeling heard, feeling blessed, feeling part of something larger than his own small existence on the edge of a vast ocean.